Well, hello again, everybody. Here we are in my music room at my home, and this is either week 3 or 4 of my doing these recordings, reminiscing and maybe even adding some things that I've learned over the years about some of these great original LPs that I'm putting up on the auction block in an attempt at narrowing down my collection of 30,000 records, which I've accumulated over the last 40 plus years. So again, we've got some Mercury living presences, and the first one of which is an interesting one. It's actually SR 90265. It's Rimsky-Korsakov, Capriccio Espagnol, Russian Easter. It's got a couple of Borodin pieces on it, Prince Igor, and these are all conducted by Antal Dorati, conductor, one of the big conductors actually in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and one of the exclusive Mercury living presence artists, and very highly sought after. Interesting, this copy is an AMS 16102 catalog number, which means that it is a UK pressing. And here's what's interesting. It's an FR2, FR1, right? I've talked about this before, where those aren't actually stamper designations. They are mother designations. So FR stands for fine recording, and then 1 would be the first lacquer that was cut, and FR2 would be the second lacquer. In this case, side 1 is an FR2 and side 2 is an FR1. Now, how is that? Well, it could be that the FR1 master and mother, weren't approved. There might have been a defect, there might have been a problem, and so they would have recut it. So that would be a likely outcome. But I think here's what's even more interesting about this. I had heard before, and I confirmed by looking. You see, you can sort of tell that it's a little bit different. Mercury Living Presence pressings in the United States are a little different label and a little different setup on it. But in the lead out groove is where the scribe is for this, the catalog number, and then also this designation FR1, FR2, FR3, 6, whatever the number is. And what it appears to me that this is one of those copies, or that what Mercury did, and I think Wilma told me this one time, is that they cut all the parts here in the United States, and they would ship, in this case, probably mothers to the UK, where mothers are what produce the stampers, right? So that was a way of controlling the sound across the different territories back in the day, instead of sending a tape copy over and having it cut there. And then I will tell you, one of the things about my experience with Wilma Cozart Fine was that she was an incredibly exacting person. So, it was all about, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in some of these records, but she was the type of person who, if she could get another half dB on the record cut that way so that it would be louder and there'd be higher signal to noise ratio and so forth, so that it would come off better as a listening experience, she would go to the ends of the earth to do that. And it's apparent in a lot of the different activities she was involved in. So it makes sense to me that this was in fact something pressed in the UK, somehow made its way back across the pond, right, and somehow into my hands. But it's very interesting how that all turned out, in hindsight. Now, so here's SR 90269. The Soupe Overtures. I think this is a second copy that I had, and this is a PR2 later pressing. And you can also tell that there's 2 ways to tell this is a later pressing. One of which is the color of the label is a little more muted, and it's still a deep groove pressing. But also, here's an interesting thing, and this is the front of the jacket is a color, right? Is a colored jacket, and then on the back often this strip over here to the right, as you're looking at it, would generally be also in color for original pressings. And later on, if they repress this, because remember this jacket, the way it was made, it's a cardboard blank, and then they print the paper, the design on the front, and they actually adhere or glue. It's called what's called a tip-on jacket. And so you would tip on the first part, and then you can sort of see at the bottom how it rolls over and it's adhered here, and that's still color at the bottom. But then the back panel would just be one sheet, and they would, glue that on as well. And probably to save a little bit of money, to be honest, because printing black and white versus a 4-color would have been cheaper. So, just little things about these pressings and vintages that are interesting. Now, this is it's a beautiful copy, and but also I remember playing this copy against the one that was sold, I think, a week or two ago, and they're interesting in that there are some things about this later copy that I sort of like, right? But there's other things about the original cutting. So this would have been a completely different cut than the original. It would have been done probably from the same tape and so forth. But you get those kind of variations, which makes it interesting. So just some things to point out. Here's another crazy one. So this is SR 90276, Wagner per band with Fennell and the Eastman Wind Ensemble. This is one of the HP Super Disc list items. And again, you see it's probably a later pressing because it's got that back panel is in black and white as opposed to the front, which is in color. Now here's what's interesting. The pressing here is an RFR6 / an M9. So what would have happened, and this is that original Mercury deep groove pressing and label, right? But what would have probably happened here is that RFR6 mother was still able to produce stampers, but for whatever reason, side 2, they had to go back and recut. So, just some interesting variations. Here's another one of the big ones, Dorati and the Wozzeck Lulu Alban Berg suites. It's Alban Berg is the composer, SR 90276, and this is. Remember, I said at one point that at some point they switched over from doing FRs or fine recordings to RFRs, and I'm not sure what the R standard, the R instead of the FR stood for exactly. I think people have some speculations about it, but this is an RFR1. I believe this to be an original pressing because of a couple of things. One, I think it's got an original color jacket. This is also, and I'd forgotten about this, this is a 35 millimeter original recording, right? So it's film, 35 millimeter film, and what they did back in the 50s was, and Mercury kind of pioneered this, they coated the film, and this is when I say film, I mean film for motion pictures, right? But they coated the film with oxide and made strips that were recordable. And in this case, they did a 3-channel, and they had a special machine that did these recordings and so forth. And the sound quality was pretty stunning. And that's one of the reasons why Mercury is as renowned as it is for these 35 millimeter recordings. But they only started later on, like the earlier ones, and I can't remember when it was, somewhere in the 200s or something, they started doing these 35 millimeter recordings. And by the way, what's interesting is, at first when they did the 35 millimeter recordings, they would also do the conventional 1/2-inch 3-track recording as a backup, right? So at first it was experimental. And then I think at some point, as I recall in an interview with Bob Eberens, the guy, one of the recording engineers, that was in the mobile truck that went to Russia, and he worked with Wilma and C.R. Fine and so forth. He said at some point they just switched over to 35 millimeter and they wouldn't do that 3-track half-inch. But this is probably one where there's a 3-track half-inch as well. And one of the things that I wrote a little note to myself is that there's a very small lead out on side 1. And you can't see it, but I can tell you that the lead out is like maybe 1/4 of an inch. And if you look at most records, classical records or otherwise, there's usually a pretty big lead out. And what happens is the louder that you cut a record, it takes up more room on the side, right? Because the cutter head, the cutting stylus is moving a lot more dramatically with more level, right? Both up and down and side to side in stereo recordings. So it chews up more of the side. And Wilma was famous for doing this sort of thing where, and I'll just digress a little bit and say that one of the issues that some of these records have is that if you put them on a turntable back in the day that had an automatic changer, that you would get to the inside of the record and the automatic changer was based on where the tone arm was, and it would automatically lift up. So this record, probably in the early days, they had some complaints with people that had these record players that would lift up because you'd lift up before the end of the side. And that was based on the fact that Wilma just wanted that last half dB or dB out of the side. And it's, you can hear the difference because you get a bigger signal to noise ratio, and hence the fidelity of that comes through. It's louder, right? So anyway, wanted to put it out that side 1 was cut hot, right? All right, here we go. Another great title, SR 90281, Debussy Nocturnes for Orchestra. And there's also Ravel, Daphnis and Chloe, the suite number 2. Perret conducting Detroit. This was a beautiful pairing. And what I have here is that this is a white label promo copy. Now, I'm reminded, and you'll notice, that it says on the label, right? It says promotional record, right? And down at the bottom, it says for broadcast only, not for sale. Mercury Record Corporation, Chicago, Illinois. So, these white label promos, as I mentioned the last time, they're highly desirable because they came off of the first mother generally, although I learned some things I'll talk about in a little while that suggest that maybe that's not always the case. Certainly, it was off the first approved mother. And anyway, as I recall having gone through these and seeing these white label promos again, I seem to remember coming across a collector one time that had a big collection. He might have been a reviewer, I can't quite remember. But I think I bought every one that I possibly could, and this is one of those. And it's just in stunning shape. It's got the so-called original inner sleeve, right? That, what they did back in the day was they used that landscape back here to promote some of the other recordings on the label. So, there's Sylvia and the famous Dorati Firebird are listed back here, and Swan Lake. Some of those records are actually in this pile we'll get to in a minute. But, and Giselle and so on. So it was a way, I guess, to promote, to advertise some of the other recordings on the label. And of course, this is, again, remember I showed you that this is an original copy, I'm sure, obviously because of the promo, but also because of this color back label. You can see that instead of it all being black and white, this is a 4-color back. And really, really nice copy. Here's SR 90282, the Gunther Schuller 7 suites on the theme of Paul Klee and Dorati in Minneapolis. And really, this is the other big pairing. Antal Dorati was the principal conductor at the Minneapolis Symphony, and so a lot of these recordings were done in Minneapolis. In this case, it was commissioned by the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra and the American Music Center commissioning series under a grant from the Ford Foundation. So that's how these classical recordings were made back in the day. Again, I've got a note here, small lead out on side 1, cut hot. That was Wilma at work again. Gosh, love her. Here is one of the famous ones. This is on the HP Super Disc disc, the Rachmaninoff Concerto No. 3, with Byron Janis playing the piano, and London Symphony, conducted by Antal Dorati. So sometimes Dorati made that that move across the pond in the old days. Was not as easy as these days. And met up with Byron Janis there and the London Symphony, because they didn't bring the London Symphony over. They took Byron Janis and Dorati over. And this is an RFR6, and with an original back sleeve, trying to promote Wellington's victory. The biggest boom on records, featuring Beethoven in Mercury living presence. This is the 1812, and with Wellington's victory on it and so forth. And this is, I think, an original pressing, because you can see the profile of Byron Janis on the back. And what I love about some of these, and Wilma was fantastic. This is a 35 millimeter recording, by the way. But sometimes they would have these little diagrams on the back that are fantastic, because they would show the setup of the orchestra and where the 3 microphones were actually placed and so forth. And it's called Hi-Fi Facts, right? This Mercury recording of the Rachmaninoff Third Piano Concerto is a disc with a difference. It is the first living presence album to be recorded not on tape, but on film. So this was the beginning of it. 35 millimeter magnetic film represents the most revolutionary advance in Mercury's recording technique since the single microphone technique was pioneered in 1951, and the 3-channel stereophonic technique developed in 1955. And it goes on, and I'm going to take the time here because I think it's instructive. What does film recording mean to the record collector? Interesting question. It means better, broader sound with a greater distortion-free dynamic range. It means that instruments and singers' voices excuse me, are more accurately recorded in terms of timbre, clarity, and naturalness, thanks to the absence of on film of flutter and background hiss. It means that the entire recording gains perspective and spaciousness. And that really is a testament to Mercury really pushing the boundaries. And if I have to say that one of the things that I learned from Wilma, I was already down that road, but it was pushing the boundaries in terms of trying to make the best product possible. And so, I laud Mercury's effort back in the day, and here we go. Here's another Byron Janis recording. I think this is a repeat. There's another copy of this that we had up a couple of weeks ago. Again, a 35 millimeter recording, Byron Janis, Kirill Kondrashin conducting the Moscow Philharmonic. And this was in the mobile truck, as I mentioned last time, that they took over. Bob Eberens was in the truck, and Wilma and Bob Fine were there as well. So another great copy. As I mentioned before, on one of the Mercury inner sleeves, they had this Sylvia, the complete ballet, London Symphony with Anatole Fistolari. Not a well-known conductor, but a very fabulous conductor. Conducted a lot, actually, of the Decca recordings that are famous. Some of the so-called Decca RCAs, that many of which Classic Records put out. Fistolari was the conductor on those. And this is a 2-record set. And one of the interesting things back in the day, and I'll just point this out, is that they had different inner sleeves. And this is an example. I'm trying to remember what what I refer to this as, but let's just stay with me a second and I'll figure it out, I think. Oh yeah, that's what it is. So, this is an example. This is not an original, well, let me take that back. This probably is an original inner sleeve, but you'll notice that it's not printed on. This is parchment. And this is the type of thing that used to be in the 40s and 50s and 60s, even through the 70s, that when you had film that you developed, the negatives would often be put in a little parchment bag. And it's got a coating on it, so it's nice and slippery and doesn't scuff the records. So you've got a variety of different inner sleeves, so to speak, that Mercury used over time. And this is an example of the parchment inner sleeve that they used in a 2-record set. It's kind of the equivalent of the rice paper sleeve that audiophiles use these days. But I just find it curious that some of these different sleeves. So here's another example. I'm just going to show you the sleeve first. So this is one of those plastic inner sleeves, and this is an original because, by the way, this is a white label promo, right, of this title. But here, and notice, I'll take it out completely. Notice that it's half round. It's got this, it's not complete. And then what happened was across the top is a little perforated, and it had a little perf, and you would pull that off. So it was sealed. This inner sleeve was sealed. And of course, this is an original copy. You can see the color, art jacket, and so forth. This is a beautiful performance of the Sibelius Second Symphony with Perret conducting Detroit. Again, he was the principal conductor there. And this white label promo for broadcast only, not for sale, was from that batch. And so here is a situation where you've got an FR2, FR6 white label promo. Head scratcher, probably no FR1. And it could easily be that the FR1 didn't pass the listening test or it was rejected. And the FR6 on side 2 suggests that they went through a bunch of cuts before they got something that they really liked. So there you go. That's just what happens. Wagner, Perret in Detroit. This is another big Harry Pearson record. RFR1, RFR4. White label promo, I say maybe side 2. It took 4 cuts for them, so that's why it was an RFR4. Nice white label promo, as I mentioned before, colored back jacket, and I bought these from the same person, all of them, because there's actually still a little sticker on the back from all those years ago when I bought them. Cacciatore and Gaina Ballet, Tchaikovsky, Romeo and Juliet, London Symphony with Dorati, who, remember, principal conductor at Minneapolis, but Mercury had him under exclusive contract. This is an RFR3, here's yet another Mercury printed inner sleeve, right? So you've got, this is a line listing with this sort of gold Mercury records, and you've got, the symphonies, the concertos, the operas, contemporary works, concert for wind. So they marches and military music. So if you've bought this thing and you're looking at it, it's like, oh yeah, look at that, like nice piece of advertisement. Interesting. Look at this back. Remember what I said before about this must be a later jacket because the back is all black and white. On the color back jackets, all this would be in color. The Mercury and the Mercury Living Presence would be red, and this would be color. So this was a later jacket, even though it's an RFR3. Who knows what the story is there? Let's see, what do we got? Strauss, Don Juan, Death and Transfiguration. Again, Dorati back with his principal orchestra, the Minneapolis, SR 90202. This is an FR1, white label promo. And see, here we've got the paper inner sleeve, right? And it's got, Mercury high fidelity stereo records, and it says, how your stereo hi-fi works, so stereo hi-fi record works, right? And so this was in the day when most records before this, early days of stereo, were all mono. So people had mono record players and mono stereos and one speaker, because you only had one channel. And so here's a situation where they're trying to educate people about what makes hi-fi, which would mean two-channel stereo, so important. And they've got all these pictures and diagrams about what a monaural record groove looks like and a stereophonic record groove looks like, and explaining it to the consumer to probably get them to go out and buy a stereo, another channel of playback, or a whole new stereo setup, so that they could enjoy the wonders of stereo sound. In fact, this was during a time where Mercury would have put this recording out in mono as well, right? So it would have been MG and I think the same number, which would be the mono version of it. And so people had a choice between the two. And if I recall correctly, I wasn't around then, mind you, but I've seen some stickers and I've talked to people. There was $1 difference. So the mono would be like $4.99 or $3.99, and the stereo would be $4.99. So another reason to try to convince people why that extra $1 was worthwhile. So yeah, this would be an original sleeve, original color jacket, and the thing about the difference in stereo and mono, certainly in classical recording, is that in mono you get a really solid image that has some depth to it, front to back, but it's all sort of in the center, right? And when you get stereo, so two channels, and you get two sets of speakers, right, instead of just one speaker in the middle, now you get more of a landscape. And you can now start to place the instruments in different parts of the soundstage and so forth. So when they were they were actually able to record stereo before they were able to cut it into records, right? The first stereo recordings were made in the early 50s, but they couldn't use them because there was no stereo record. And I think in about 1957, there was an experimental technique by the Westrex company, the Cutterhead people, and they made an experimental recording. And actually, interestingly, the major labels were not the first labels to bring stereo. There was a company called Audio Fidelity that actually pulled a little scam, a little trick on the side, and they had the Westrex people cut them a record on this stereo lathe, and they pressed it and they brought it out, and they were the first ones to have a stereo record. Unfortunately, there weren't any or very many stereo systems around at that point that could do this two-channel thing. So, but it was all about innovation, and that's just a little explanation about, all of what happened, 60 or 70 years ago. So here's, this is one of the big HP Super Disc List records as well, SR 90199, the Respighi Ancient Dances for Airs and Lute, Suites 1 and 2, Dorati, Philharmonia Hungarica. And this is, I think, an original pressing as well, FR2, RFR1, interesting. Let's see about the jacket. It's a color jacket. So, hard to know what that pairing's about, but, and I have, again, hot side A. So the lead out groove on side 1 is, it's almost non-existent. It gets to the end of the record and bang, you're finished. Okay, I've got a few more here. Liszt, with Schmentana and Mussorgsky, Night on Bald Mountain, and Sibelius with London, the London Symphony, again conducted by Dorati, 90214. This is a white label promo with the yet another Mercury advert sleeve, right? Popular hits in jazz. specialties for you, trying to sell people on other. But this is a beautiful, beautiful promo, white label promo. It's a beautiful copy too. I mean, it literally looks like it's unplayed, but I mean, I would have played it, and gosh knows, but it wasn't played very much because it's in perfect condition. Marcel Dupré, remember, playing Franck. Marcel Dupré, an organist, playing the organ at the St. Thomas Church in New York City, recorded by the Mercury folks. Very nice copy. Couple more. Here we go with SR 90191 overtures with Paray and Detroit, French overtures effectively. Very nice copy of same, color jacket, so early pressing. And again, here we've got March Time. This is Fennell, if everybody recalls. He did a lot of music for winds and brass and so forth. Eastman Symphonic Wind Ensemble called March Time, and I have here color jacket. This is interesting. It's an FR1, so this is the first pressing. But here's an example where you've got the original paper inner sleeve, right? Remember, we've seen that before. The Mercury with the gold and overlaid with all the other recording. But this record also has one of those parchment inner sleeves. So makes me wonder whether this came this way, or whether the collector who bought this put a parchment sleeve on it like we do rice paper these days. It's hard to know, but that's how it is. Just a couple more. Hansen Symphony No. 1, the so-called Nordic, SR 90165, RFR1, white label promo, color jacket, original paper ad sleeve with the old Wellington's Victory on it. You see the white label promo, for broadcast only. Beautiful, beautiful copy. Must have come from that same source. And then the last one, SR 90260, which I think we've had another copy of that. RFR1, RFR3, color sleeve, perfed half-round inner plastic bag that you all have seen before, right? And the color back sleeve of a profile of Janus, getting ready to really come down and play that. This is a fantastic piece, the Rachmaninoff Concerto No. 2. This, unlike the other one we talked about where Dorati and Janus went over and recorded with the London Symphony, this is Byron Janus in Minneapolis recording with Antal Dorati, his native symphony, or his primary symphony, and this is an absolutely stunning recording that I recall in the day got some amazing reviews. Anyway, I hope my long-windedness today hasn't exhausted people, but I just wanted to share it. I've had a lot of fun going through all these things, and these are going to be offered up this week. So if any of this is interesting to you, it will do my heart very good to know that these records end up in the hands of people who can play them and enjoy them as much as I have. So thanks so much for listening, and good luck.